So firstly, they rate among the largest economies in the world. China is, meanwhile, the largest economy with a share of around 23% of global output, followed by the EU with 21%. The EU's economies themselves are headed by Germany, ranking on place 5 of the biggest economies worldwide. Secondly, and not very surprisingly, China and the EU, together with the US, also lead the list of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters, with China accounting for nearly 30% and the EU for about 10% of global output. Here, Germany is, as a single country, on place 6. Thirdly, and beyond the aspects of responsibility, China and Germany have shown in recent years that they are willing to play a stronger role in climate action. At the latest since November 2014, when Xi Jinping and Barack Obama jointly committed themselves to strengthen their efforts concerning climate protection in Beijing, China made it clear that it could not only take a stronger but a leading role in climate policies. The same can be said for Germany, illustrated by leading the EU to agree on ambitious climate goals in 2007 and presenting itself as a pioneer in climate protection, not least via the plans for an energy transition from the year 2010, the so-called Energiewende. Both Germany and Germany as well as China affirmed their views that the withdrawal of the US administration from global economy as well as from climate action requires increased commitment from other states and that they would be willing to assume leading roles in both areas. However, a key problem remains. A vital global economy and climate protection are not only both areas that represent great challenges to the international community, their respective objectives are to a considerable degree inconsistent. It is undoubtedly good news that the global emissions haven't increased much for the third consecutive year, but this does not imply a potential of decoupling economic growth from global emissions to an extent that would be in any way sufficient to reach the objectives necessary to limit global warming to 2 degrees, or let alone 1.5 degrees. To achieve that target, a drastic reduction of climate-altering emissions to a minimum would be necessary. And in order to make that happen, a distinct trend reversal in this decade would be needed. So the question at hand is not whether China and Germany could assume more responsibility in 2 important policy fields, but firstly, to which extent do China's and Germany's roles on the international stage allow them to change the balance between economic and climate issues in favor of the latter, even if the US government retreats from supporting ecological goals? And secondly, how far is the institutional setting suitable to support the building of new climate partnerships, setting this priority? In a recent paper, I looked into the domestic and foreign expectations towards states in regards to climate policies through the perspective of a role theoretical approach. But I think I won't go into the theory because I just heard from Jörn Gottwald that you're experts on this already. So, but I give you a short overview of the results concerning the options and obstacles for the Chinese and German governments to develop a strong position in climate negotiations. Let's have a look at China first. What are the domestic expectations in regards to economic and climate targets? We know that China pays a high price for its rapid economic growth in terms of accelerating ecological problems. And solving them has become a prerequisite for future legitimacy of the Chinese leadership, which has long been based on economic successes. A sustainable development has therefore been a key policy since 2001 already. And until now, however, there are no visible successes of this policy. All important environmental parameters have worsened. Meanwhile, as you can see here, ecological aspects rank very high in the perception of the Chinese population. Recent surveys show that an intact environment is now considered to be more important than economic growth. Nevertheless, despite a decreasing efficiency of poverty reduction by a supply-oriented economic policy, overall economic growth is still perceived to be the prime instrument in the combat against poverty, and therefore indispensable. Based on this assumption, all social and political groups which advocate a stronger climate protection and environmental protection as well, including the NGOs, for example, and academia, do not at the same time doubt the necessity of further strong economic growth. That is to say, despite the impacts of environmental degradation on the daily lives of people, and although it is clear that China will be seriously affected by climate change, the question of whether climate protection and strong economic growth are compatible goals is simply not raised on political level. Foreign expectations as well fluctuate between these environmental and economic demands. The fact that China is now the largest emitter in the world has been causing mounting pressure from the industrialized countries, demanding a more active participation in climate protection. With its nationally determined contributions, China has seemingly succeeded in meeting these expectations. But a closer look reveals that China's reduction targets, however positive a turnaround in climate politics might be, still leaves considerable room for improvements. Among other things, the peaking year around 2030 could be at least 5 years earlier. The measures formulated are not specific enough to show a real potential to decouple economic growth from emissions. And above all, as the emission targets of minus 60 to 65% per GDP unit are efficiency related, it is not at all clear at what level they will peak. So in fact, while being a concession to external expectations and old environmental necessities, the NDCs leave enough room for prioritizing economic growth, which can be considered at the same time as coherent with domestic expectations. To understand the positioning of other states, it is necessary to also look at economic-related expectations. The breakdown of the world economy in 2007 proved to be an important milestone in the making of a new role for China, namely that of an economic powerhouse, giving fresh impetus to a sluggish world economy. China fulfilled this role, for example, by providing several stimulus packages between 2008 and 2010. The G20 became the main framework for the role-making of China as a responsible economic power. This role is not only appreciated by the G20 countries, it also corresponds to domestic demands for a more prominent role of China on the international stage. Committing to a strong economic performance in the future is therefore in line with external as well as with domestic expectations. It is evident that the different expectations create a tension field, which is not tackled in the hope that both policy areas might be compatible. Germany is caught between the same conflicting priorities as China. Germany's energy transition and its contribution to the EU's NDCs, a reduction of 55% until 2030, were strong signals that the German government was willing to take the lead in the transition to a sustainable energy supply. It even aims at a reduction of 80 to 95% until 2050. So without doubt, a rigid climate policy is also in Germany's own interest. The impacts of global warming are not only becoming directly noticeable in many areas like agriculture, healthcare, water management, etc., but Germany will have to deal with indirect effects, such as more climate migration. Although a majority of German population also is in favor of a stronger focus on climate issues, as you can see here, the compatibility of economic growth and climate protection as well is not really questioned on a political level. Even the Green Party, being the strongest advocate of ecological goals in the German party landscape, is split on the question whether open criticism of economic growth as a risk for ecological viability would jeopardize their position as an electable political party. Germany is perceived as a strong economic power. External as well as internal forces expect Germany, as the EU's strongest economy, to act as an economic motor and an anchor of stability. The conflict between economic and ecological targets has only become clear lately when the German administration struggled for an agreement on its climate action plan in the run-up to the climate conference in Marrakesh last year, and in which economic objectives diluted rigid climate goals. The fact that Germany's emissions have been rising again lately, mainly due to higher transport emissions, illustrates the ongoing struggle between economic and ecological goals. Against this backdrop, the possibilities for a new alliance on the international level that would be able to shift the focus to consistent climate protection are actually quite limited, especially considering that not much pressure to do so comes from domestic or external forces. In addition, the current institutional framework is not likely to facilitate the process of bringing together economic and climate goals, with a focus on the latter, at least not beyond the narrative of an easy compatibility of economic growth and climate action. On the one hand, we have, for example, the UN framework on climate change as the main platform to negotiate climate targets, and on the other, the G20 aiming at financial stability and economic prosperity. The discussion of economic and ecological problems remains largely separated. Nevertheless, the G20 shows potential to overcome this dichotomy. During the Chinese presidency last year, climate change was put on the agenda as the most urgent and pressing issue. Although the G20 will certainly primarily remain a forum focused on economic dynamics, this suggests that the G20 could at least provide a platform to perceive together climate change and growth-oriented development as two sides of a coin. In a special report for the German G20 presidency, the German Government Advisory Council on Global Change recommends to link to last year's agenda in enhancing the focus on climate issues and going further to promote the idea that a societal transformation is necessary in order to maintain ecological viability. However, the G20 meeting in Hamburg will be held under very different political conditions. So how the new US government threatens to change priorities in the Hamburg summit already became evident during the G20 meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors in Baden-Baden in March this year. Due to the vehement opposition on the US side, the final communiqué solely focused on economic growth and did not even mention climate change. Whether a change of focus can be successfully initiated by new alliances, such as between China and Germany, under such changed conditions remains to be seen. But if new partnerships could keep climate change as a key topic on the agenda, or even introduce the German Advisory Council's recommendation This would definitely inject new momentum into partnerships for more climate protection. Thank you very much.